Welcome to the Diversity and Inclusion Seize the Moment webcast. Featuring Tim Wise, Chanel Park, and Karen Ashley.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our Seize the Moment August Town Hall. If you recall, in July, we launched our Seize the Moment action plan with a commitment to have candid conversations about race, racism, and the implications of both for us here at AEP. So we have with us this morning our distinguished guest, Mr. Tim Wise, and if you all will notice, we are social distancing. We took our masks off because, as we've discovered, we had to climb a few flights of stairs, and when we got to the top of the stairs, we couldn't breathe, so we took the masks off, so we know that we need to do some exercise. And would you say that's right, Tim, Chanel?
I would say that's right.
Yeah, I think that's right.
I need new knees as well, so yeah.
Exactly. So we're excited about the conversation that we're going to have this morning. I'll tell you all a little bit about Tim. Tim, we know you are an expert at what you do, one of the nation's most prominent experts on anti-racism, right? You're an author of several books. Yeah. You've spoken across the country, I believe also even in Canada.
Yes. And
Bermuda, right, for the past 25 years. Mm-hmm. And we know you started when you were, what, 2, 3? 4?
Yes, right,
something
sure.
like that.
That's very kind of you. Yeah, right.
So
sure.
also in your background and some of the work that you've done, you've trained corporate, government, law enforcement, and medical industry professionals on methods to dismantle racism in their institutions, right? So we're really looking forward to hear what you have to share with us this morning.
Sure.
But before we dive into the conversation, we'll go over a few housekeeping items. So for our viewing audience, please make sure that you send your webcast questions to questions@aep.com. And then also there's going to be a link that we're going to ask you all to use to fill out some survey information to provide feedback for us. So you'll have that link. It will be a part of the AEP Now story that you'll have access to that will be coming out after the webcast. All right, did I leave anything out? Nope, good. All righty, so let's dive in.
Sounds good.
Let's dive in. So we know, Tim, that the George Floyd killing, right, along with the coronavirus pandemic, has exposed long-standing racial inequities and racism, right, in every aspect of American life, and it's forced this deep reckoning that we're dealing with across society. So we know that all strands of racism are significant, right? And we need to work to eradicate all of them. Yet, historically, we seem to find ourselves coming back to this same place where Black people, in particular, find themselves at the bottom of the pile, right? We keep coming back to this same place, and I think that's kind of the motivating factor behind the Black Lives Matter movement.
Right.
So with that, share with us why it is that as a nation, right, we continue to find ourselves in this place with the treatment of Black people, of Black Americans, and then how does the Black experience, right, differ from that of other racial and ethnic groups, right?
Well, there's a lot there, right? First, it's a real honor to be able to be here with you. I'm sorry that we're in sort of a, a relatively empty building and not able to do this with everyone live, but it is great to be able to be here and to do the webcast with you and to talk about some of these issues as it relates to AEP as well as the society. I think the answer to your first question is deeply embedded in American history, and unfortunately, it's an American history that we don't really learn very accurately or adequately. The truth is, this country was in many ways founded on a contradiction. It was founded on the contradiction of liberty as a promise, but subordination and oppression as a reality, right? And so we had the rhetoric of all men are created equal, but that, of course, line was written by a man who owned 237 approximately human beings at the time he wrote it. which is to say that there was a rhetoric and there was a reality, and they weren't the same. And the reality was a reality of black subordination. So that goes back well before Thomas Jefferson, in fact, who wrote those words. It goes back to the colonial period. It goes back now over 400 years. And when you have a 400-year history of an idea, the inferiority of black peoples in particular, as well as indigenous people whose land was taken, obviously, and who were extirpated from most of the country, and millions losing their land as well as their lives and cultures and heritages to white supremacy, you can't be surprised when a couple hundred years later that continues to come back around again. And in fact, it is the most consistent, persistent theme in American history. So we ought to ask ourselves why. It seems to me the answer is because it is the most deeply embedded one. It was there at the founding. It is, as some have said, the original sin, if they use that language, but it is deeply, deeply baked in. And so until we disentangle that, until we unspool that, we're never going to be free from it. You know, James Baldwin had a way of saying it. He said, these innocent people, speaking of white folks in particular, who often miss this history, because black folks know the history, most of it, but white folks don't. And he said, these innocent people are trapped in a history they do not understand. And until they understand it, they cannot be released from it. So we want release from it, right? We want to be free of it, but you can't be free of the history until you grapple with the history. And by the way, that's not just a thing about race and about a nation. That's about any of us individually, right? If we want to be free from the drama and the trauma of our own families, because we all come from dysfunctional homes. Some of us admit it, some of us don't, right? But when you have trauma and drama and you want to be free from it, you have to get help for that. You have to have a therapist, you got to talk to somebody, you have to deal with the stuff that's in there. We haven't done that as a country. So that's number one. That's why it's still there. The second piece about the difference between the black experience and other folk of color experiences. White supremacy was premised on the notion of obviously the superiority of European peoples, who weren't called white, I should point out, until they were in the colonies of what became the United States. That wasn't a term that was used to describe Europeans. You know, English folk didn't consider themselves family with the Irish, didn't consider themselves family with Italians. We weren't one big happy club, right? White was a thing that gets created in the colonies. Now, why did that happen? Because this is why you know the black experience is somewhat different. It happened because at the time, you go back to the mid-1600s, there was not permanent chattel enslavement. So you could be a person of African descent in those early decades of the 1600s, early 17th century, and you would have been an indentured servant in all likelihood, much like poor Europeans. But in the middle of the 1600s, that begins to change. In the middle of the 1600s, the courts begin to carve out very specific laws and rules in colonial Virginia, for instance, and elsewhere, that said that if you were a person of African descent, your children would be held in bondage in perpetuity. So now you would have inherited bondage. You would not be free after 11 years of indentured servitude, or 7 years, or 13 years. You wouldn't have that luxury. You would remain in bondage permanently. And this was a way to divide black people, now called, from white people, now called, and take even the poorest white person and put them on a level above any black person. And so why did they do that? Well, they did that because you had poor white folks and poor black folks who could look around and see that they were all getting screwed over, right? I mean, you had the rich landowners, had all the land, didn't like the poor white folks, didn't like the African folks either. And every now and then, these white and black folks would look at each other and say, you know, something is not right. We need to sort of get a better deal. And so you had Bacon's Rebellion in 1676, where you had indentured African peoples and indentured white folks, as well as enslaved African peoples, who rose up in rebellion against the governor of the colony. And seeking to overthrow the elite in Virginia. So at that point, you can imagine the elite were like, well, that's not really working for us. We can count. We understand that we're outnumbered. The only way that we can stay in power is to divide and conquer these white people, who we're now calling white, and these black people, who we're now calling black. So anti-blackness, right, was developed hand in hand with white supremacy as a way to keep working class people at each other's throats. Now, that has been extended to other people of color. Don't get me wrong. We do the same thing with Latinx folks with regard to immigration. We do the same thing, and we have had white supremacy aimed at people of Asian descent, obviously, Japanese internment, as well as other examples, obviously the extirpation of indigenous peoples. But anti-blackness was there at the foundational level, and so all that other racism aimed at non-black persons of color jumps off of the base, the foundation, the cornerstone of that is anti-blackness. So when other folks of color catch hell in this country, it has usually been because they are viewed as too close to blackness. The closer you are to blackness, the more hell you're going to catch. And by the way, that also extended to European people. So in New Orleans, where I lived for 10 years, there was a period in the early 1900s where the Italians, because they lived next door to black folks, because they worked in jobs with black folks, because they miscegenated with black folks, made children with black folks, married and recreated with and hung out with black folks, they would often find themselves the target of lynching in New Orleans, the target of police violence, but it was because of their proximity to blackness. And it was about the desire to keep everyone who wasn't black as far away from blackness as they could be, because that was the bottom floor beneath which people could not be allowed to fall.
Wow. Okay. That was a lot.
That was a couple hundred years of history in a few minutes, right?
In a few minutes.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. So clearly, as you said, this is foundational.
Yeah.
Foundational to who we are as a nation.
Right. 400
years. That's a lot to dismantle.
Yeah.
Right? That's a lot to dismantle based on what you just shared. And you're right, trauma, drama in our families, we all have it, but it's interesting, to your point, we don't talk about it.
Right.
We don't talk about it, we sweep it under the rug. So, you know, I hate that we're in this place, but I think it's great that now we're in a place where we're forced to have these conversations. To have these conversations. So speaking of that, being forced to have these conversations, now everybody is finding themselves talking about race and racism. And there's a lot of terminology that's confusing, that's not quite easy to understand, that's nuanced, right? So help walk us through. There's one phrase that continues to come up, right? And we talk about privilege. You know, we know also there's a book, there's a term out on white fragility, but this concept of privilege.
Sure.
What is privilege? What does it look like? Give us some examples of it. Is it good? Is it bad? Can it be used in a good way? I know I'm packing a whole lot of questions into one.
Sure. Well, I mean, privilege, when you think about the word privilege, I think if you ask 100 people on the street, what is it? They would say, well, that's, you know, being born with a silver spoon in your mouth, being born with a trust fund, being born, inheriting a lot of money. And that's part of it. I mean, that's obviously, if you have any of that, you are living a privileged life. That is class privilege. That is socioeconomic privilege. But there are multiple forms of privilege, because class is just one of the identities that we have, right? And so we also have racial identity, sex and gender identity, sexual orientation identity, physical ability as opposed to disability identity, religious identity, geographic identity. We have all kinds of identities. And they all have areas where one group, or sometimes a couple groups, have more advantage than other groups. And when a group has disadvantage in a particular area, by definition, everybody that's not that group has some advantage over them. This is just grammar. This isn't politics. This isn't ideology, right? So if I say, for instance, that able-bodied people have certain advantages over people with disabilities, I don't think anybody would argue with me. Even if I were to use the term privilege and say, you know, it's sort of a privilege, isn't it, to not have to think about discrimination on the basis of disability because you're able-bodied. It's sort of a privilege, isn't it, to know that the workspaces are probably made with people like you in mind, because most of us are able-bodied. You know, now if we live long enough, we're all going to be disabled. That's the irony of it. But if I were to say that, nobody would be like, wait a minute now, I know able-bodied people who are poor, so there's no able-bodied privilege, because I know able-bodied people that are broke, and I even know some disabled people that are rich. Nobody would argue that. But if I say there's white privilege, right? If I say that in general it pays to be white in the society historically and today, or if I say there's male privilege, right, that generally speaking it pays to be male in a male-dominated society, then all of a sudden everybody says, well, actually my family's from Appalachia, so we don't have any white privilege. Wait a minute, hold on now. If you can be able-bodied and poor but still have able-bodied privilege, what does the fact that you might struggle economically mean in terms of your white privilege? It doesn't take it away, it complicates it, right? So a poor white person clearly not as advantaged as an affluent white person. But the point is, in all of these areas you can have advantage in one, disadvantage in another. It's just the flip side of discrimination. So if I were to say, for instance, historically, based on that history I just gave you, if I said, look, historically there was a thing called white privilege in America because African-descended people were enslaved, segregation and lynching took place, theft of indigenous land, I don't think anybody would argue. It doesn't matter what you think about today. You could be in total denial about racism in 2020, but you would still agree that historically there was a thing called white privilege, that historically it paid to be white. Well, when did that stop? And why? If I asked somebody, when did that stop? Because see, I think that would make news. Like, I think that would be front page headline, like, today's the day that it ended. And I haven't seen that headline. Now, if someone were to answer me by saying, well, we passed civil rights laws. We passed the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act. That's when it ended. Okay, for real, because we pass laws against murder, and there are about 14,000 people get killed every year. We have laws against carjacking. We have laws against theft. We have laws against sexual assault. We have laws against, everything, and things still happen. We have laws against tax evasion. We have laws against all kinds of stuff, and those laws continue to be violated. So just because you have a law doesn't mean that the problem goes away. You still have the inertia of history that piles up. And so what I want people to think about, it's not a shaming thing. It's not about saying you ought to feel bad. You're no more responsible for the history than you inherit, that someone else is responsible for the history that they inherit in terms of blame or shame. But we are responsible for what we do with that history. Right? And if I can inherit that $1 million from my family, which I'm not going to, by the way, I don't have that kind of family. But if I did, I don't think I would sit there and say, well, I'd love to take that, but I didn't earn that. I wasn't there. I didn't make all that money, so I don't think I should take. No, I'm going to take the $1 million, right? If you offer me $1 million or a house or some property, I'm going to take it. And I'm going to take it without much hesitation, but we just don't want to take the bad part and deal with the bad part. We want to inherit the legacy of the good, but we don't want to deal with the bad. And that's a privilege to be able to do that, right? It's the privilege of being oblivious to how the past affects the present. It's being able to not understand that inertia is a property of the physical universe, not just of the political universe, not just the physical. Property of the economic universe. What happens in one generation affects the next and the next and the next and the next. And so, it's complicated. I'm not saying that everybody has the same amount of privilege. Yeah. We all have some. I mean, I've never been in a room where there was somebody who didn't have any area where they had privilege. Because in order for that to be the case, you would have to be in the marginalized identity on like 15 categories. I've never met that person. Even someone who faces racism as a person of color, or sexism as a woman, or heterosexism as someone who's LGBTQ, might be able-bodied and still have able-bodied privilege, might have a college degree and have educational privilege, might be Christian and have Christian privilege in a mostly Christian society. I'm not saying that anybody is just one thing. Yeah. But when you do have privilege, you have to be accountable for that. I grew up in Nashville, Jewish, so I didn't have Christian privilege. In fact, I dealt with anti-Semitism. I dealt with teachers who would tell me I was going to hell because, but I still had an advantage as a white man, and so if I wanted solidarity from others around my being Jewish and catching hell for that, I had to offer solidarity to others when they were catching hell because of race or gender or whatever it might have been.
I was going to ask you, what is that being held accountable for privilege? What does that look like? What does that mean?
I think it means just being honest. Really, this doesn't have to be painful and it doesn't have to be shameful. And there's no change is going to come because white people feel bad about white privilege or racism, or because men feel bad about sexism and male privilege. That's self-indulgent. Actually, that's a privilege, right? To be able to sit there and get all wrapped up in how I'm feeling about the fact that I'm now aware of this. Like, that's not healthy or helpful. But what I do think will help is if we can take some responsibility for the world that we've inherited, the legacies that we've inherited, both good and bad, then we can appreciate the good and we can enjoy the good, but we have to remember that there's this other piece of it. And if we do that, then that's just called being an adult. That's called being responsible for the entire picture, not just taking the good and leaving the rest. And so I think, to me, being held accountable means if I'm in an institutional space, I need to be thinking about all the ways that the policies within that space, could be an employer, could be a school, could be a neighborhood organization, a church, a mosque, a synagogue, whatever it is, all the different institutions that we belong to and interact in. I need to be thinking about what are the policies that exist within that space that maybe I haven't given a lot of thought to because they seem so normal to me that I never interrogate them. I never ask questions about them. That might be perpetuating inequality. Because, see, I think a lot of this is the result of obliviousness to that question. I don't think it's that you have a lot of people in corporate America necessarily who are sitting around every day conspiring to hurt black and brown folks, or conspiring to hurt women, or conspiring to hurt working class folks or disabled folks. I'm not saying there aren't people like that. There are people like that everywhere. But I don't think there's folks, it's not Oz behind the curtain, you know? It's not overt racists sitting around plotting and scheming how they can harm people. What it is people who are generally pretty good folks, like I think most people are, who have not adequately asked questions about the things they take for granted, like in employment, old boys networks for hiring. If people are being hired disproportionately, and the evidence says they are, based on who they know more than what they know, who can write a letter for them recommending them for that next job opening, then who gets that job is going to be contingent on who knows Jim over in the HR department, or who knows, you know, Tom over in accounting, or whatever, right? And who's Tom more likely to know, according to the evidence? Someone like Tom, right, who is also disproportionately likely to be white and male and middle class or above, and Tom's friend might be a perfectly lovely person and might be very good for the job, but what are the odds Tom actually knows the most qualified person for the next job? I mean, really, mathematically, the odds that the guy who you already got knows the next best guy, pretty unlikely, right? But if we don't cast the net wide and really do the proper amount of job search and think about the way that those networks exclude people of color, exclude women of all colors, exclude working class people, including working class white guys, then those people get left out. And even though they might be the best person for the job. So you get systemic racism perpetuated through that, and that's a privilege of being oblivious to the way that your policies affect other people. So being accountable means let's sit down and let's interrogate those policies, standardized testing in schools, even though we know we have unstandardized students who went to unstandardized institutions with unstandardized training, unstandardized resources, unstandardized curriculum. You have to interrogate that. So I think, to me, that's what holding our institutions accountable looks like. It's saying, hey, let's really think about the stuff that we haven't thought about so far.
Have you seen any companies do some groundbreaking things in terms of reviewing policies, questioning them, and changing them? If so, what are companies doing?
Well, let me say this. So I am always reluctant to go out on a limb and say anything overly glowing about any institution, because I have learned that when you do that, whether it's a company or a college, or a state government, or a nonprofit organization. I've worked with all of those. And there have been times that I have said, for instance, oh, look what so-and-so's doing, and literally 6 months later, they go off the rails, do something absolutely crazy. Folks are like, why did you say such nice things about them? Because, you know, YouTube is forever. So this stuff gets out there, and they're like, you said in 2005, and I'm like, yeah, I know, I shouldn't probably have said that. So I'm not going to give specific examples, but I will say there are institutions that I have seen that have moved further down the road than others. And what they have in common, right, is a willingness to acknowledge that they have a positionality in a larger social structure, that they don't exist in isolation, and that they carry the baggage of the larger society into every room, that race is in every room, gender is in every room, class is in every room. All these different identities affect every aspect of the culture, and so they're willing to have this sort of radical moral inventory where they can really sit down and say, hey, let's not assume that our hiring practice is fair. Let's start with the assumption, in fact, that in a society of racial disparity and gender disparity and class disparity, that it's probably not fair. That's the safer assumption, and work backwards, right? And then maybe if you find something that is good, then you can pat yourself on the back for that. But if you start with the assumption that everything is good, you will only find a handful of problems. If you start with the assumption that things are probably sideways, you're going to actually get to a better place. And it's more realistic, because to believe that the system is functionally fair is to believe that you as a company or a college or a nonprofit or whatever have carved out the rarefied air where this stuff doesn't penetrate. It's just not very likely. So what they all have in common is that willingness to do that bold inventory of their practices, from hiring and recruitment to subcontracting. How do you subcontract with folks? Who are the people that you know and that you work with? What are the policies you have? We know that historically, for instance, a lot of companies that do subcontracting with different vendors If that's a small vendor, say a small company that, and disproportionately if it's a black or brown owned business or a woman owned business or a working class owned business, a lot of times they don't have the same amount of receipts, they don't have the same amount of revenue, so their ability to get the work done, you know, their billing process might take a little bit longer than someone that has a lot of money and they can get the billing done in 30 days and they can get, you know, and they might need 60 to 90 days. And a lot of times they get cut out of the subcontracting process because, oh, you can't get the work done as fast, or we can't get the paperwork done as fast. But that's a function of their size, which is a function of their identity and the fact that they've been on the margins. They might do great work. But if you have a particular set of policies in place that say, well, we've got to have this turnaround in X number of days in order for billing, in order for purchasing, then it's like, oh, well, then we leave out all of these folks. I know nonprofits that do the same thing, where they get grant money from foundations, and the foundations say, okay, we're giving you money for 3 years, 3-year grant cycle. And in that 3 years, we want to see these things happen. Well, that's fine, except if you're working in a community that has been marginalized economically, racially, or whatever else, that community doesn't just open up to you when you walk in there with a notepad and a pen and say, we're trying to find out some things so we can help you. If I live in that community, my first look is, who are you exactly? Like, I've never met you before. Why do I trust you? You want to come in here and help us do what? It may take 2 years just to build up enough trust in that community for them to even open up and do the stuff with you that you're wanting them to do. And then the 3-year cycle runs out and the foundation says, we didn't make any progress, so we're going to pull the funding. See, so sometimes we have to think in ways that account for the way that racial subordination, economic subordination have marginalized certain institutions, or else we end up cutting them out of the loop in ways that perpetuate injustice, even though we don't want to do that.
Right, right. Is that part of the systemic structural racism, kind of that we've been talking about, examples of that? Okay. All right, so I'm going to detour just a little bit and ask if you will share some of your story with us. How did you come to start doing the work that you do?
Right. Well, I think, you know, this is, for me, really important piece, because right now we have all these folks who I think are, and it's wonderful, who are coming to this consciousness mostly through what they're seeing in the news, and they're coming to it through books that they're reading, and they're coming to it through videos that are often horrific that they're seeing on the internet. And they're coming to it from classes maybe that they're taking, and I think all of that is great. I don't care what brings you into the work as long as you come into it, right? Consciousness is great no matter the source. But for me, what I think has really been especially important, and I think it is really critical down the line if we're going to have sustained white involvement in this work in particular, is I don't come to my anti-racism through my politics. I came to my politics and my ideological beliefs through anti-racism. I grew up in Nashville. I was born in 1968. I grew up a child of the 70s and early 80s. And, you know, I was in spaces where spatially my connection to black folks was very different, I think, than a lot of white Americans. I mean, I went to a preschool at a historically black college at Tennessee State University in North Nashville. So I was 3-4 years old in an early childhood ed program where, you know, 25 out of the 28 kids were black kids. The women who ran the program were black women. So at the age of 3 and 4, let's say 4 years old, I'm being, number one, I'm being socialized in a non-dominant space. So I'm being socialized in a way that is not telling me that I'm the norm. In fact, quite the opposite. It's telling me, actually, in this particular space, you're not normal, right? Nothing wrong with that, but you're just not the norm. Don't take it for granted. Second thing it's doing is, it is socializing me to black authority, right? Because the women that ran the program are black women. So I'm learning in 1972 to trust black women, to respect the authority and the wisdom of black women in ways that I dare say very few 4-year-old white children even today are taught to do, let alone in 1972. What does that mean? Well, it means two things. Number one, just being in that space means that when I get into first grade in 1974 and I go through K-12 in the Nashville public school system at a time when the system was really just becoming fully integrated. And I went to schools that were about 40% black, 35 to 40% black most of the way through. And I'm seeing those black kids treated differently. I'm not reading about it. I'm not watching a video of it. I'm not reading a book about it, taking a critical theory class. I'm literally seeing it with my own eyes. And the difference is, because I'd gone to Tennessee State, those were my friends, or they were people that I identified with. So it wasn't abstract to me. Now, if I had been another white kid in that class who grew up and went to preschool in a white space and didn't really know black people, I probably would have missed it, because I don't have any investment in those people. I don't know them. So all I know is, oh, they're over on that side of the room doing that level work, and we're over here doing this level, and they're getting sent to the office, but maybe it's because they're breaking the rules. Well, I knew that we were all breaking the rules. I was breaking the rules as much as any of them, but I was being treated differently. So I'm seeing that. Now, I don't know what that is yet. I'm 6 years old. I'm not smart enough to go home to my mom and say, Mom, you will not believe the institutional white supremacy at Burton Elementary School, right? I mean, I'm not that hip. I was six, right? But I knew something was happening, and it's like you're filing it away in the back of your mind, and over the years it just piles up, right? And later on in life you reflect on it. The second thing that Tennessee State did was being subordinated to black authority meant that when I got into my 20s and I graduated from college in New Orleans, I went to Tulane, and I was doing community organizing work in black communities, mostly public housing. And the women, the leaders in that community, all of those communities were mostly African-American women. So when those black women are telling me, this is what's up, this is what's happening in our neighborhood, this is what's happening in our lives, this is the struggle that we're experiencing, I'm going back to that 4-year-old who's being taught that black women know what the hell they're talking about, that they're not just seeing things, they're not making things up, they have every bit as much wisdom and insight as anybody else. And so I'm not gonna be in that moment, that white person who I think sometimes we can be, which looks at that, you know, who looks at that black person who's telling them about racism and says, are you sure? Like, maybe you're exaggerating, right? Like, you could be seeing things, like you could be playing a race card, you could be making this up. No, I'm gonna go back to that 4-year-old who says, wow, I figure you probably know what you're talking about. I probably should get busy on doing something about that. And so I really credit that experience, right, with building a foundation where I was able to hear and take into my brain and into my body the wisdom that I was then taught, mostly by black mentors in New Orleans. I mean, I went to Tulane, very white school, but the mentors I had in the community were mostly black folks. And there were also some white allies as well who were instrumental, but you know, what I learned there, I mean, I went to Tulane, it was the whitest place I had ever been. And it's in the middle of a black city. So to be in a black city in a really white space was jarring for me. And I just remember, you know, thinking about and having other people point out to me. I mean, I was doing anti-apartheid work regarding South Africa because it was the 80s. And there were black folks in New Orleans that were like, yeah, this is great. Really glad you're doing this. By the way, could you potentially throw in a few words about apartheid in this city because we're still living it? And I'm sitting there going, oh yeah, you know, that actually sort of makes sense. But I had to get called out on that. And I had to have people who said to me, look, this is nice that you're dealing with racism 8,000 miles away. Meanwhile, there's a man named Adolph Archie who just got murdered by the New Orleans police. They put him in a police car, drove him around the city of New Orleans, beat him until every bone in his face had been crushed, dumped him at Charity Hospital where he died, and the coroner wrote it up as homicide by police intervention. I mean, that was his official cause of death. And we're sitting there, those of us at Tulane who were doing the anti-apartheid work, protesting South African apartheid, protesting South African racism on the day that Adolph Archie's murdered. We're sitting out middle of a hunger strike reading the newspaper thinking, oh, that's terrible. Well, it's not just terrible, it's connected to what it is you're talking about. But we weren't even with however much I understood, it took having people point that out to me, the contradiction, right? Connect the dots between these things for me to be able to do it. So it's a constant struggle. You know, my story is, I mean, I was very fortunate, but to have that background. But even then, you're learning things every day. You're always learning new things. And I'm just fortunate to have been taught at an early age to listen to people when they tell me these things.
Yeah. So I would imagine the experience as a 4-year-old, right?
Yeah.
It would have been easy as a white man, right? Privilege to say, okay, you know what, that was my experience. That's bad, but I'm going to walk away from this. This work is too hard.
Yeah.
I'm going to face a lot of peer pressure.
Yeah.
You know, why are you doing this? You know, why are you not supporting us over other people? Yep.
Right.
So help us understand how, first of all, did you experience that?
Sure.
Did you experience that? And then, you know, why decide to keep going forward? Why decide
yeah, no,
to keep going forward?
that is a great question. I think for any of us who do this for any length of time, those questions always come. You know, why, I mean, you're viewed as a race traitor, you're viewed as someone who's giving away the family secrets. But what I came to understand was that racism and white supremacy are not just damaging to black and brown people. So this is not selfless work that I do. This is not altruism, it's not charity. What I came to understand is that this is really a dangerous and deadly system even for white people. And here's what I mean by that. And this is what really, for me, made it a permanent way of living and the work that I do rather than just something that I think about from time to time. So when I graduated from college, I graduated in 1990, and that's the year that many folks watching this will recall that David Duke, former Klan leader, lifelong white supremacist, modern Nazi, was running for the United States Senate in Louisiana. In 91, he ran for governor, but in 90, he was running for Senate. And I was involved in the campaigns against him. The two guys that started the primary anti-Duke organization were friends of mine. So I got the job the old-fashioned way. I had networks, right? Again, privilege. And that was my first job right out of college, was doing anti-David Duke work. Well, in 1990, Duke did lose, and in 91, he lost again when he ran for governor. But in the 90 race, he got 6 out of 10 white votes. He got 605,000 approximately votes overall. It was 60% of all white people voted for him. And it wasn't because they didn't know he was a Nazi. Everybody knew he was a Nazi. It wasn't like a secret. In 91, he got 55%, so his percentage went down a little. But he still got 55% of the white vote, which is to say, if it had been up to white people in Louisiana, we would have had a Nazi as a United States senator and or governor of the state. And to see that at the age of 22 and 23, and to have to sit with what that means, right, is incredibly powerful. Because those of us who were involved in the work realized in that moment, I can recall very clearly sitting there after the election thinking, if it's not for black people saving us from ourselves, we're going to have a Nazi as governor, or we're going to have a Nazi as a U.S. senator. And it's black folks who basically were like, no, not today, not today. We're going to stop you, and y'all can thank us later. And we never did, right? And so I realized in that moment that there's something that doesn't make sense about black people having to save white people from white supremacy. Right? I mean, black people were clearly saving themselves too, right? It's like, this is going to hurt us. But it was also like, we're going to do this for y'all, because y'all clearly do not see what we see. So we're just going to go out here. We're going to save you from the damage that you're about to do to your state, to our state. And in that moment, that's when I realized this is not about saving black people. Right? Black folks will save themselves. That's what slave rebellions were. That's what the civil rights movement was. That's what the movement against David Duke, led by black folks, was. The question is, who's going to save white people from the damage that we've done? Because when I see 600 some odd thousand white people vote for a Nazi, and I know that we don't have 600,000 something Nazis in Louisiana. Like, I know that. We do not have 600,000 Klans people in Louisiana. We don't have 600,000 Nazis, but we have 600,000 to 700,000 in the governor's race who are willing to vote for a guy who is all of that. Why? Because they are in such pain and have been led to believe their pain is caused by black people, that they're willing to go out and vote for him because he blames black people. Now, that's a white problem, see. It's a problem for black people, because David Duke and people like him make it a problem for black people, but it's a problem of white people. And so we have to figure out a way, because I know some of those people. I remember there was a guy that I worked with as a community organizer, because I organized not only in black communities, I did some organizing in white working class communities also. And there was a guy I had met who was doing some activism in his community. He lived in Destrehan, which is along the river. And there's black Destrehan and there's white Destrehan. And this guy was in the white part of Destrehan. And he worked side by side with black folks to try to fight a grain elevator that was polluting the water that they all relied on, polluting the soil and the air that they all relied on. They were environmental activists trying to clean up the environment in and around the river where they all lived, and the water they all depended on. And one day, as I'm sitting there going through David Duke, one of the things I had to do was go through his financial reports, because we would try to find whoever was giving him money, and if there were names that jumped out to us as being like really well-known Nazis, we wanted to point that out, or really well-known people generally. So I'm going through the list one day, and my eyes are starting to glaze over, and it's all these people, I don't know anybody, it's $10 here, $5 there, $20 there. And then there's this guy's name. This white guy that I had been working with, that we had broken bread together, him and me and a black guy that he works with on this campaign, and we're all sitting around having dinner, and he gave David Duke $200. And it was $200 that this man did not have. But he had decided that this guy was going to be the guy who would deliver him from something. And I thought to myself, I know that man, right? I know he's not an evil, horrible person, but he's willing to vote for somebody who's all of that. That is a white problem. And so my job as a white person is to work on that. It's not about saving others, it's about saving my own people, quote unquote, in the narrowest sense. And to me, that's why I can't just sort of walk away from it, because you can walk away from charity, or you can change your cause. Right? If you have a cause one week, you can change it and you can give to a different charity next year and write it off your taxes. This is not about that. This is about realizing that there's a real damage being done to the soul and the psyche of the dominant group when it latches on to people like David Duke to solve their problem, when obviously black people are not the source of the pain that those folks were experiencing, but you had somebody come along and tell them that was the case, and that was the direction they went.
Yeah, and believed it, and believed it, and believed it. Okay, so thank you for sharing your story. So why don't we, I have one more question, but before that, why don't we take a few questions?
Yeah, okay. So there's some questions that have come in from employees. So Tim, here's one for you. What's the benefit of tearing down symbols from the Civil War, or renaming music groups, or changing labels from products that are on the stores? How does that help the racial situation?
Yeah, well, if it's all we do, it doesn't, you know? If it's the only thing that we do, is engage in the symbolism of it, then that ends up being pretty empty. But I think what those things do can be very meaningful. I'll start with the statues. You know, first of all, we take the statues down because statuary really does not serve, let's be honest, they're not history texts, right? History texts are books, and they have footnotes, and they're written by historians. Or maybe it's what you see when you go into a museum and you have docents sort of walk you around and guide you. A statue is a worship altar. I mean, that's just what it is. And that's true whether it's a Confederate statue or whether it's a statue of Abraham Lincoln, for that matter. They're all worship altars. I'm not a huge fan of statues in general because I think they are really, historically, they're attempts by human beings to craft, you know, sort of immortality upon ourselves so that we'll always be here after we're not actually here. And I think there's something deeply psychologically troubling, but I get it. It's a human instinct. All cultures have done it. I just think if we're going to do it, we want to make sure that the statuary that we're honoring and that the worship altars that we're creating are worthy of the worship or worthy of the praise. And in the case of the Confederacy, they're simply not. I mean, these are statues that were erected in the early 1900s, long after the war had ended, by people who wanted to erase the reality of why the war had been fought and wanted to lie about it, because the Confederacy was very clear about why. They said they did it to maintain enslavement and the system of white supremacy. They gave no other reason at the time. It was the only reason they offered. And then they started lying about it 30 and 40 years later when people had died. They said, oh, it wasn't that, it was states' rights. So these statues are dishonest, first of all, and they honor an ignoble cause. And so removing them is a way of saying we actually don't honor our enemies. And these people went to war against the United States, and they didn't just go to war against the United States. They went to war against the United States because they didn't think the United States was committed enough to racism, which is ironic because the North was still very racist. It's not like the North was this bastion of racial justice and equity, but the South looked at it, and I say this as a lifelong Southerner with family going back 400 years in the South, looked at it and said, yeah, it's just not bad enough, right? So number one, it's absurd to honor those folks. They do not deserve any place of honor at all. They represent an army of a government that lasted for 4 years. As far as renaming other things, renaming buildings at colleges, renaming the names of bands and groups. I think those bands, of course, have to make their own decisions, but I think those are good decisions because when we use certain terminology, when we have certain people's names on buildings, again, as ways of honoring them, we are saying that there's something about this person or this name which is okay to us. And when we remove those names, we say, actually, we have evolved to a place where that's not okay. We can still respect, for instance, Thomas Jefferson's beautiful words of all men are created equal, but we have to do that in an honest way. Now, I would never say take down the Jefferson Memorial, but I would say we need to fix it, because if you go to the Jefferson Memorial and you read the walls, there's carvings in the rotunda, right? And one of the things that's carved in the wall is the line about nothing is so sure as that these people shall be free, or something. I'm paraphrasing, but he's talking about enslaved people. He's saying nothing is so written in the sky or a hand of God as that these people shall be free. And then there's like an ellipses, and it goes on to something else. Well, in the actual letter that Jefferson wrote, the rest of that sentence said, and there's also nothing so certain as that they cannot live in the same government as us. So Thomas Jefferson was not actually making an anti-racist statement. He was making a statement which was highly problematic, and we don't tell the truth when we clip it like that. I want us to tell the truth in our history, and I want us to learn the truth, and sometimes our symbolic politics, which all politics are symbolic, go in the direction of covering up truth rather than illuminating truth. And so I think, you know, it's not wrong to engage in symbolism, but we just want to make sure the symbolism fits the moment and that the symbolism moves us forward rather than moves us backwards.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Karen, any follow-up questions or thoughts for that?
Nope. I think that's good.
Yeah.
Is there another question?
Yeah, we have some more. So there's a few questions that have come in about we're working from home. A lot of us are working from home. We're doing social distance. How do we do this work in a way that, because a lot of people are going back to communities that are like themselves, so they're disconnected, and how do we continue this work back home and in the company?
Right. Well, I mean, it can be tough, but it's also a good time for people to explore and to deepen their understanding of the dynamics. I mean, one of the reasons I think that we're seeing this uprising in this moment, in spite of lockdown, is actually because of lockdown. I think, to be honest, if we're all going about our normal routine after March and we're not at home and we're not quarantined or sheltering in place, I don't think this movement is happening at the level it's happening, because I think we're going to be too busy. There's going to be too much noise, too much other stuff happening. So it is precisely because of the relative quiet, I think, that people have actually been able to feel in ways that maybe in the past you could hit that snooze button. You know, you see Eric Garner choked on the street of Staten Island, hit the snooze button. You see Tamir Rice shot in Cleveland, you hit the snooze button. You see John Crawford killed in Dayton, the Walmart, you hit the snooze button. Here you see George Floyd, and not only is it 8 minutes and 46 seconds, but it's also, you can't get away from it by going to work. Where are you going to go? You can't get away from it by going out with your friends and having drinks. Where are you going to go? So I think in this moment, actually, with the lockdown, yeah, it's harder to connect in some ways, although, look, the demonstrations for racial justice have been huge. The biggest uprising physically in the history of the country, happening at a time when we're sheltered in place. And people went out and they put on their masks, and as a result of putting on their masks, they didn't spread, apparently, according to the research, the virus. So you can do that. You can actually connect with people if you're smart about it, in ways that won't be dangerous to you or to them. But I think in this moment, you have the opportunity, read more, listen more, watch movies, watch videos, documentaries, actually take this opportunity, consider it like going back to college or graduate school, where you have the opportunity. Because how many of us have that opportunity, once we're out in the world of work, right, to actually take classes, so to speak, to actually spend some time learning the things that you didn't learn is very difficult, because you got a million other things going on. Well, now you have a million minus some, and you can fill that space with that additional learning, so that when we do come out of this thing, and we will, I hope, I think, I'm counting on it. At some point when we come out of it, then we'll be in a position where we're acting on the basis of greater information and knowledge, as opposed to waiting until we're out of this and then we try to get, because it's going to be really hard, right? When we come out of it and everybody goes back to their quote-unquote normal routine, how are they going to do all of this reading and listening and hearing and talking to people and interacting online? Some of the interaction online has actually been really good. I think people are opening up in ways that they might not if they were sitting right there with somebody. You know, there's a certain distance, a certain level of anonymity, even though you're on the call, but there's a certain ability, that if you got to get up and go get some water, you can, you can, if it gets too tight for you, you can always say, oh, I got bad connection, and, you can get out of the room for a moment if you have to. So I think we can take advantage of this moment in a lot of ways, yeah.
Oh, we may be about to ask the same
Okay, go
question. So we know we have the list of your books, right, as a set of resources. What other resources would you recommend for us? What movies? Are there any Netflix documents? Anything that we maybe can watch?
Well, Netflix has a whole section curated, sort of Black Lives Matter collection of films, both documentaries and feature films. And I think they're all, incredibly valuable to watch and give you some information. I'm always reluctant. I don't want this to turn into just like a racially curated Google, right? I don't want it to be like, here's the book list, go read this. But at the same time, there are some amazing things that people ought to be reading. I always recommend Carol Anderson's book, White Rage. She's a professor of African American Studies at Emory in Atlanta. And her book, White Rage, is a very slim volume, probably like maybe 200 pages. But it gives you this history of how every step forward in the struggle for black freedom and liberation has been met with this backlash, and she traces it all the way back to emancipation, so that we understand that everything we're going through right now with some of the reactionary backlash is not really new. It's all part of a pattern, and it's important to know that, because sometimes if you think that the current moment of backlash is new, you're very anxious and you don't know what to do with it, and you think, oh my God, what are we going to do? Well, you're going to do the same thing folks have done for the last however many generations. You respond to that and you keep moving forward. I also recommend, obviously, Ibram Kendi's work, Stamped from the Beginning. There's also a YA version aimed at young adults, but it's actually good for anybody that's sort of starting at the 101 level. It's just called Stamped. It's a slimmer version, sort of a streamlined version of Stamped from the beginning. And then his newer book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, obviously also definitely worth checking out. You know, all of Bell Hook's work, Angela Davis's work. I have a reading list on my website, which is timwise.org. I haven't updated it in a while, but there's a lot of good stuff on there, and I tried to divide it by subject. So there's stuff on criminal justice, stuff on education, stuff on the labor market, stuff on history. You know, just lots of different places. But I think, you know, wherever you start, just start. You know, and also don't just rely on scholars. I think part of this is getting clear on your own story. So I can read Kendi and I can read Carol Anderson and I can read, for that matter, you can read my work, but it's still somebody else's work. And maybe it'll connect to you, but what you need to be doing with it is then figuring out what does it mean for you. Because there's a reason, see, that those books speak to me. There's a reason that I can read Carol Anderson and know what she's talking about. That has to do with my personal reflection about my own upbringing. Everybody has a story. And I need for people, especially other white folks, to really begin to think about our racialization experience. I think most black and brown folks have thought about it. I think most black and brown folks can tell you how they were racialized in this society and what their experience was. But when I ask white folks the same question, a lot of times we haven't given it that thought because we haven't had to. That's part of the privilege piece. Yeah. But I think that if we actually spent some time thinking about where did we grow up and what did that have to do with race? What did our parents do for a living and how was that connected to race? Where had they lived and what did that have to do with race? Where did we go to school and did that have anything to do with race? The classes that we took, what did we learn? What did we not learn? You know, how did we get our first job? How did we get our foot in the door of whatever institution we're at right now? If you start asking these, and I was told to ask these questions by the black mentors that I had in the city of New Orleans with the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond. They said, look, you need to take inventory. Why do you care about this stuff? And if you're someone who all of a sudden is finding yourself caring, you need to ask yourself the same question. What is it about this moment that makes you suddenly stop hitting that snooze button? Because when those folks in New Orleans asked me that question, why did you not hit the snooze button? My answer was like, you know, it was something cute like, well, injustice is, you know, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, which of course is Dr. King's line. And they looked at me and they were like, yeah, that line is taken, so you need to keep working on that.
Come up with something else.
Yeah, you have to come up with your own thing. Yeah. And so then I realized I had to dig a lot deeper. And when I did, that's when I came to realize a lot of that stuff I told you about before, about my upbringing, that I hadn't really dug into or thought about. And once I started thinking about it, I realized, oh, that's why, right? That's why. It's not because I read something. It's not because I watched a movie, even though I did read and I did watch films. But it's also because I'd lived it. And once I reflected on the experiences that I had had and some of the experiences that I had not had, because as a white person I could avoid certain experiences or have certain other experiences, that's when it really became personal. And when it becomes personal is when you will stay in it and it won't just be a sort of a transitional kind of temporary thing.
That's good. So that is great homework. That is great homework that we can do, an outcome, a takeaway from today. That's great. That's great. You're a journaler? I know you write books.
Yeah, I always encourage people to do it. I should do it more than I do, but I do always encourage people to journal or even just, you know, we all have phones now. Most of us have phones that have a recording app. And sometimes, so if you're not someone who likes to write, you know, you can just take that little voice app that's on your phone. And if you get a thought in your head, hit record and record yourself talking through stuff. I mean, I do that all the time. My wife thinks I'm talking to myself and I've lost it, you know. But talking to yourself is really a good, or talking through ideas and thoughts is a really good idea, a way to get clear on things. And sometimes when it comes to putting pen to paper or sitting and typing stuff, people get frustrated with that. Writing doesn't come as easily, but we've been talking since we were little kids. Writing is an acquired thing. Talking is sort of, we just do it, you know? And so I think sometimes you just speak it out. And maybe you don't talk to anyone else about it at first. Maybe you just sort of talk your own ideas into a recording device and you can listen to it later. I've done that many times, and I've found that I've refined those ideas over time. I go back and listen to stuff that maybe I put down on a recording 2 years ago, and I'm like, well, I don't know what I was getting at. There are other things that I listen to and go, oh, wait a minute, now I know, I want to add something to that, you know? It's just a way to, it's very therapeutic, and I also Yeah, I mean, I'm in therapy. My therapist said I should tell everybody that because it's therapeutic. But like for real, no, seriously, like as a country, there's something we could stand to do some therapy around this. And the problem is most therapists are not really trained to deal with this piece. You know, most therapists who provide therapy or psychological and emotional counseling to folks of color are not prepared unless they're people of color who really take this piece seriously. A lot of white therapists don't know how to do it. They really don't know how to talk it through with their white patients and clients and folks. So we have to do some of that on our own. But it's really about, you know, that self-talk piece, which is a therapy technique that you can do to sort of talk through, even if you're not quite sure what it all means. It's okay to be unsure. You know, part of what the system has done to us is it has taught us a certain degree of helplessness around this subject. You know, it's learned helplessness. We don't know how to talk about this because we don't have enough practice, and we don't have enough practice because the society doesn't encourage us to really practice this conversation. You know, I grew up in those schools, like I said, that were about 35 or 40% black, and a lot of the problem in those schools was it was just taken for granted. Well, we have diversity, so everything's good, right? But we had huge issues. We had a race riot in my high school my senior year. Now, interestingly, it wasn't white folks against black folks. It was white and black folks who had been in school together for, at that point, 12 years, fighting Southeast Asian kids who were refugees after 1975, and we didn't learn anything about these kids. They were Vietnamese, Thai, Lao, Hmong, etc., and we didn't have to learn anything about them. They were shunted over into like one corner of the building learning English like all day. We didn't know any of them. We didn't interact with them. We weren't encouraged to learn anything about them. That's a form of racism too. Why didn't we learn about them? So then we end up having a full-scale race riot in this really diverse school that was known as an excellent school where everybody got along, but did we really? See, and the problem is we have a school system that said that's not really important. We don't need for you to learn things about other people. We don't need for you to understand where they're coming from. And so what it shows you is you can have diversity and you can have people in a community together, but if you're not having the hard conversations, then you end up with these kind of problems, and we did. And so, you know, it takes a lot more than good intentions and getting the numbers right. You have to actually create a culture that is sustainable.
Yeah. And so I think, Tim, you probably have segued us into kind of the last question around healing, right? Healing. What do we as a nation need to do, right? What needs to happen for this healing process to take place?
I mean, I think on the collective level, there are two things we're going to have to look very seriously at doing. One, and it's the easier of the two, but it's not necessarily easier, we'd have already done it, is we have to do something akin to what South Africa has done, something akin to what Rwanda has done, something akin to what has been done in Northern Ireland in certain instances, and a few other places around the globe where you had these sort of truth and reconciliation processes. Now, I'm not a big fan of the word reconciliation because to me it's very hard to reconcile that which was never consiled in the first place, but that's the term they use, truth and reconciliation. I might prefer truth and justice or whatever, but the idea being we have to, and I mean we need to do this in every community because every separate individual community has its own history of racial injustice, and the history in Nashville is different than the history in Columbus, which is different than the history in Philadelphia, which is different than the history in Butte, Montana, right? They all have their own localized examples and histories, vis-a-vis indigenous people, vis-a-vis black folks, vis-a-vis Latinx folks, vis-a-vis Asian folk, et cetera. So I think every community needs to begin excavating that history and really being honest about how the space that they occupy currently came to look the way that it does. If we don't do that, we can't heal because we're not being honest and accountable to the past and the processes that brought us to this place. So that's number one, is truth and reconciliation or conciliation or justice. The second piece is we have to talk very seriously about material reparation. And I don't mean, and white people hear this and they get very nervous. They think it means that we're going to have to write checks to black people next week. I'm not talking about a line item on your Quicken, right? I'm not talking about like, here's the water bill, here's the cable bill, here's the black people bill. We're not talking about that. I'm talking about systemic repair. You know, what this country did after World War II is we spent billions of dollars, what would now be hundreds of billions, if not trillions in dollar value, to rebuild our enemies We did this after World War II. We rebuilt nations we had been bombing. We rebuilt through the Marshall Plan places where we had been at war. We created the GI Bill, the VA loans, the FHA loans, and overwhelmingly, black and brown folks were kept from those loans, even though they were veterans too. They had been GIs too. They were coming back from the war, couldn't get loans, government guaranteed loans, even though they'd fought for the country. We spent billions of dollars and guaranteed loans worth hundreds of billions for white families. We did all of that as an economic development tool for working class white people. And like I said, we rebuilt our enemies under the Marshall Plan, as well as other parts of Europe that had been involved in the war, including our allies. We spent all of this money to help essentially white people. And you know what it did? It created the white middle class. It was actually really good money spent. It was very smart. It created white housing opportunity. You had, you know, before that happened, you had very little white middle class. You just had the haves and the have-nots, and there's very little in between. We did all this government spending to create the white middle class, but we left black folks out. So when I say systemic repair, I'm not talking about something crazy. I'm talking about what we already did for white people, what we already did for working class white people, what we actually did for some of our enemies after World War II, what we have done in the past, but that we denied access to black and brown folks. We're talking about systemic infusion of money. And we're talking about money that these communities would have had in the first place had it not been looted from them vis-a-vis segregation, vis-a-vis enslavement. So it's not really taking from people who earned what they have and giving to people who didn't earn what they would now have. It's about taking from the larger society that which would have been black and brown folks in the first place and making sure that some of that is there for their schools, for their business development opportunities, economic development, their hospitals, healthcare access. It is about the government saying that we're going to make right what we made wrong. And we're going to do for black and brown folks what we already did in the middle of the 20th century to create the white middle class. If we did that, you know, we would have a very different economic reality, and not just for black and brown folks. That would benefit white people, because when you put money in the hands of people that don't have it, they spend it. And they don't just spend it with themselves and their neighbor and their cousin who owns a business. They also spend it with the larger society. So now that has a economic rebound effect and a multiplier effect that benefits the entire country and raises the net worth of the country. So we got to do both of those things if we're really going to heal. One piece is psychological and emotional, mental. One piece is material, and they both have to happen at some point. Now, we can discuss and debate the different ways of making that happen, and that debate has to happen. We can't just say, this is what it's going to look like, right? We have to have a real deep discussion about what repair looks like, but that's the language we need to be speaking. I know that much.
Will we see it in our lifetime?
I think we can see some of it. I mean, I don't see any reason why we can't do the truth and reconciliation or truth and conciliation piece in a relatively short time if we have the will to do it. The repair piece is going to be a long-standing, ongoing thing. I see no reason why that process can't begin, though. I see no reason why we can't begin to create autonomy in certain communities, giving communities the resources and letting those communities decide what to do. Do they want to use a certain amount of income or money for, health care? Do they want to use it for economic development? Do they want to use it for schools? Giving communities control over their own law enforcement, who polices their streets, who teaches their kids. Part of repair is not just the money, it's also the power, right? So if I'm saying, well, in your community, we know we have a police violence problem, police brutality problem, but the police who are policing your streets, you have no control over who they are. They just get assigned to that district, or they get assigned to that precinct. Why are communities not having the say? Why is it that if I want to be a cop in a black or brown community where I know that there's a history of tension, a history of abuse, why don't I have to get the approval of that community? Why don't I spend the first 60 to 90 days getting to know people in the community? I have no gun, no badge, no arrest power, but I knock on doors and I go into the barber shops and I go into the coffee shops and I go to the church, the mosque, or whatever it might be, and I sit with people and I talk to them and I find out what their hopes and dreams are for their community, and I tell them what mine are. We get to know each other, we build relationship, and then they vote on me whether or not I get to be a cop in their neighborhood. See, because right now they have no control. Same thing with teachers. I can go and work, I can go to Teach for America and do 5 weeks of training, and then they can put me in a school system in a neighborhood I don't know anything about. I don't know anything about them. I know nothing about the families, the community, the history, but you're going to dump me because I went to Yale and I got good grades and I have a good intention and a good heart? No, why does the community not have the ability to size me up, to sit me down, to talk with me, and maybe at the end of 3 months or 6 months say, I don't know about that one. That
Yeah.
one seems, same thing with cops, right? It seems to me giving some power and some control to the community would be better for the community and the teacher and the cop. Because if I'm a cop that gains the trust of the community before they give me the gun, before they let me loose in the neighborhood, right? Then that person who sees me is not going to fear me. And I'm not going to fear them because I'll know them and we'll have a relationship, right? There are steps that we can take on the road toward a more just society that we just have to think outside of whatever box we're in right now. Because right now we just keep doing the same thing we've always been doing, expecting a different result. It just never happens.
Insanity. Insanity. Well, we are 3 minutes over, so we're going to end right here. Of course, we could go on, but I know you have some things that you have to do.
Yes.
So with that, want to say thank you, Chanel, for keeping us on track.
Thank you.
Right, and for the questions, and for the reminder, you want to share everyone?
Please take the survey. It's going to be posted on the AP Now article, and I think it's there for you to see the link, and we want to hear your feedback and let us know.
Yes.
Thank
And to
you
the
all so
viewing
much.
audience, yes, thank you, Tim.
you
Thank
bet.
you for your time, and
bet.
thank everyone for watching. You all be safe and have a great day.